Picture a ship. It is the year 1735. The vessel is called the Göteborg, and it has just left the port of Gothenburg in Sweden carrying a hull full of silver. Not silk, not weapons. Silver paid up front because that was the only thing the Chinese would accept. The destination is Canton. The mission is to come back with tea. The round trip will take more than 2 years. The waters between Sweden and China pass around the tip of Africa, through pirate territory, and across the Indian Ocean. Entire crews drowned. Entire crews died of scurvy. Entire crews simply never came home. And they did all of this for what? Dried plant leaves that today cost $3 at any supermarket. That should sound ridiculous, but once you understand what tea actually is and what it cost humanity to spread it across the world, it stops sounding ridiculous and starts sounding like one of the most consequential stories in human history. Tea did not just quench thirst. It toppled governments, financed empires, sparked revolutions, and quite possibly made the Industrial Revolution possible. One plant. 5,000 years. And it all began in a place most people have never thought about. Yunnan province sits in the southwestern corner of China, tucked against the borders of Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. The terrain is mountainous, the climate is wet, and it is here that the Camellia sinensis plant evolved in the wild, the single species responsible for every cup of tea ever brewed. Green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, matcha, all of it, every variety that has ever existed, comes from that one plant. The differences you taste are purely in how the leaves are handled after picking. The oldest origin story belongs to Emperor Shen Nung, a legendary Chinese ruler from around 2700 BC, who was reportedly sitting beneath a wild tea tree when a gust of wind sent a few leaves tumbling into a pot of water his servants were boiling. Being a known herbalist and apparently a man comfortable with improvisation, he tasted the result rather than throwing it away. He found it pleasant. The legend was born. Whether Shen Nung was a real person in any historical sense is debatable, but the underlying truth the story points to has been confirmed by archaeologists. People in the Yunnan region were consuming tea leaves, sometimes chewing them raw, sometimes boiling them into primitive infusions, long before any written record captures the practice. What those early brews tasted like, nobody can say with confidence. What we do know is that for a long time, tea was not something anyone drank for pleasure. For the first several centuries of its documented history, tea was medicine. Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty, roughly 200 BC, describe tea as a treatment for headaches, digestive problems, and exhaustion. The preparation method would be unrecognizable today. Leaves were ground into a paste and pressed into dense bricks. A chunk of that brick would then be broken off and boiled in water, seasoned with salt, ginger, and sometimes onion. Calling that concoction tea feels generous. It was medicinal, functional, and by most indications, quite bitter. The slow transformation from folk remedy to genuine pleasure drink took several more centuries to complete, but the moment it really accelerated has a name attached to it. Lu Yu. Born around 723 AD, raised by Buddhist monks after being abandoned as an infant, Lu Yu became, improbably, the most important figure in the history of tea. He was not a ruler. He was not a general. He was a writer who became obsessed. Over years of travel through China's tea-growing regions, he cataloged growing methods, processing techniques, water quality variations, and brewing vessels with the kind of devotion you might expect from a scientist or a philosopher. In 760 AD, he published the Cha Jing, which translates as the Classic of Tea. It was the first book in recorded human history written entirely about a single beverage. The Classic of Tea was not a recipe collection. It was a framework for understanding tea as an art form with its own aesthetics and its own ethics. Lu Yu argued that the right water mattered, that the right vessel mattered, that mindfulness in preparation was not optional but essential. The Tang Dynasty emperor was sufficiently impressed that tea became a taxable commodity for the first time. The state had noticed that if millions of people were consuming something daily, there was money in regulating it. There still is. But one of the most important things the Tang Dynasty did not do was keep tea inside China's borders. Buddhist monks had been drinking tea for generations by then, using it to stay alert through the long silences of meditation. And as Buddhism expanded outward along trade and pilgrimage routes into Korea and Japan, the monks carried tea with them. Japan's documented contact with tea traces back to around the 8th century, but the moment that truly reshaped Japanese culture came in 1191, when a monk named Eisai returned from a period of study in China carrying powdered green tea, what we now call matcha. Eisai wrote his own text on tea's health benefits and introduced matcha specifically to the samurai class. The warriors embraced it. What followed over the next few centuries was remarkable. The Japanese tea ceremony, known as chanoyu, evolved into one of the most formally structured cultural rituals ever devised. A tea master named Sen no Rikyu, working in the 16th century, codified it into the form most recognized today, built around 4 principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. The physical space mattered as much as the drink. Tea rooms were deliberately kept small, sometimes only 4.5 tatami mats, which works out to roughly 81 square feet. The entrance was low. No matter who you were, a feudal lord or a foot soldier, you had to bow to get inside. Whatever rank you carried in the outside world stayed outside. The tea room was a space where hierarchy dissolved, at least for the duration of the ceremony. Back in China, tea culture was evolving through its own series of transformations. The Tang Dynasty preference for boiled compressed tea gave way during the Song Dynasty, from 960 to 1279, to whisked powdered tea poured into bowls. Then the Ming Dynasty, beginning in 1368, shifted things again toward loose-leaf steeping, which is essentially the method most of the world still uses today. Whole leaves dropped into hot water, left to unfurl and release their flavor. Simple, elegant, and it took China about 1,000 years to get there. By the time loose-leaf brewing had become standard practice, tea was already moving along the Silk Road. Merchants in Samarkand, traders in Istanbul, caravans crossing Central Asia, all of them were moving Chinese tea alongside silk, spices, and metals. The Middle East acquired a taste for it. The edges of Europe started hearing about it. But Europeans themselves were slow to understand what they were being offered. The Portuguese made contact with tea through their trading outposts in Macau in the early 1500s and mostly treated it as a novelty. It was the Dutch who grasped the commercial potential. By 1610, Dutch trading ships were bringing tea from China and Japan into Amsterdam. And within a couple of decades, the drink had become fashionable among wealthy Europeans. Tea was expensive, exotic, and associated with the sophistication of the East. That combination made it irresistible to elites who could afford it. Then came the moment that changed everything for England, and by extension, for the world. In 1662, King Charles II married a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza. Catherine was already devoted to tea. She drank it regularly, considered it entirely normal, and brought her habit with her into the English court. Aristocratic England watched the new queen, and aristocratic England started drinking tea. Within a generation, the fashion had spread beyond the court. Coffee houses began serving it. Tea gardens opened across London. And the British East India Company, a trading corporation with its own army and the legal authority to govern territory, looked at this rapidly growing national obsession and recognized its most profitable opportunity yet. There was a problem, though, a serious one. China was the sole source of tea on Earth, and China had almost no interest in British goods. The Qing Emperor, responding to a diplomatic mission from King George III in 1793, made the imbalance plain. China possessed all that it required and had no particular use for anything Britain manufactured. The trade was one-directional. Britain bought tea with silver, and the silver was not coming back. The drain on British reserves was becoming dangerous, so Britain found something else to sell: opium. The East India Company began cultivating opium poppies in India and shipping the drug into China illegally, in quantities that went from substantial to catastrophic. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted. The social destruction was enormous, when the Chinese government responded by seizing and destroying more than 20,000 chests of British opium in Canton Harbor. In 1839, Britain declared it an act of aggression and went to war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842 and ended with China forced to open 5 ports to foreign trade and cede Hong Kong to Britain. A second conflict followed from 1856 to 1860, with similar results. The stated cause in both cases was trade rights. The actual cause was tea, and what Britain was willing to do to keep it flowing. The human cost inside China was enormous, and the political consequences of those treaties reverberated through Chinese history for more than a century. But the British had a parallel strategy already in motion. If they could not trade on equal terms, they would simply stop being dependent on China altogether. In 1848, the East India Company dispatched a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune on a mission that sits somewhere between corporate espionage and historical audacity. Fortune shaved his head, adopted traditional Chinese dress, and let a braided queue grow from his scalp. Accompanied by Chinese servants who helped complete the disguise, he traveled deep into the Fujian province and the Wuyi Mountains, regions that were closed to foreigners and where the finest Chinese teas were produced. Fortune did not just grab a handful of cuttings and run. He spent months inside those regions, learning the processing methods that Chinese growers had developed and guarded for centuries. How oxidation is controlled, how leaves are fired to halt chemical reactions, how rolling shapes the final leaf and changes what ends up in the cup. He collected more than 20,000 seedlings and roughly 17,000 germinated seeds. He transported them in specially designed sealed glass cases called Wardian cases, built to keep plant material alive across ocean voyages. He also recruited 8 Chinese tea specialists with processing expertise and persuaded them to relocate with him to India. Fortune brought his cargo to 2 destinations: the Darjeeling region in northeastern India, high in the Himalayan foothills at elevations approaching 7,000 feet, where cool mist and altitude produce the conditions that create some of the most prized tea in the world; and Assam, further east, where a wild tea variety had already been found growing natively in 1823. Within 20 years of Fortune's mission, British-owned plantations in both regions were producing enough tea to supply the entire empire. China's monopoly, maintained for thousands of years, was gone. The cost was not felt in London. It was felt by the workers. Labor on Indian and Sri Lankan tea plantations was brutal by almost any measure. Tamil workers brought from southern India to what was then called Ceylon endured grinding hours, near subsistence wages, and conditions that fell closer to indentured servitude than free employment. Communities were uprooted and relocated wholesale to serve the industry. The wealth tea generated flowed to shareholders in Britain. The people who actually picked the leaves lived and died in poverty. That legacy is not ancient history. In the tea regions of Sri Lanka and Assam, the social consequences of how those plantations were built are still being reckoned with. While all of this was unfolding across Asia, tea was becoming a political object on the other side of the Atlantic. By the 1770s, American colonists were consuming tea in enormous quantities. It was the most popular non-alcoholic drink in the colonies. Then the British Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, giving the East India Company a legal monopoly on tea sales in America and embedding within it a tax that colonists had no voice in approving. On the night of December the 16th, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston boarded 3 ships docked in the harbor. Some of them were disguised as Mohawk warriors. Together, they threw 342 chests of tea into the water. That is roughly 92,000 pounds of tea, worth somewhere around $1.7 million in today's terms. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be called, was not just a protest. It was one of the pivotal acts of defiance that set the American Revolution in motion. Tea, in a very real sense, helped create the United States. And in doing so, it also shaped something nobody planned for. After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea carried an association with British loyalty. The Patriot movement shifted to coffee, deliberately as a political statement. That cultural decision stuck. Today, the United States remains one of the very few Western countries where coffee substantially outpaces tea in daily consumption. Americans chose their beverage that night in Boston Harbor, and they never fully switched back. In Britain, tea culture was only deepening. Sometime around 1840, a woman named Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, reportedly began requesting a small meal of tea, bread and butter in the late afternoon to bridge the long gap between lunch and a fashionably late dinner. She started inviting friends. The custom migrated outward from aristocratic drawing rooms into factory break rooms, railway station kiosks, and the kitchens of ordinary households. Afternoon tea became a national institution. The Industrial Revolution gave tea yet another purpose. Tea was cheap. The caffeine it provided kept factory workers alert through long, grinding shifts. And the boiling water required to brew it killed waterborne bacteria at a time when drinking straight from a city river could kill you. Picture a Manchester factory worker in 1850 pulling a 12-hour shift by gaslight, stopping twice a day for a mug of strong black tea. That cup kept him awake. It also kept him alive. Some historians argue it helped keep the whole machine running. By the late 1800s, British consumption had reached roughly 6 pounds of tea per person per year, and the entire supply chain, from the plantations in Assam and Ceylon, to the ships, to the London warehouses, to the corner shops, was controlled by British interests. The ships themselves became famous. In the 1850s and 60s, sleek racing vessels called clipper ships competed to carry the first load of each season's new tea harvest from China to London, because the first cargo to arrive commanded a premium price. The most celebrated of these races, held in 1866, saw 5 ships depart Fuzhou on the same day. 99 days and 14,000 miles later, the taping edged the Ariel by just 20 minutes. Crowds lined the London docks. Newspapers covered the finish as though it were a sporting final. A commodity had become a spectacle. The 20th century brought 2 inventions that changed how most people actually interact with tea. At the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, a tea merchant named Richard Blechinden was struggling to sell hot tea during an unusually brutal summer. He made a practical decision. He poured his tea over ice. The crowd that had no interest in a steaming drink was suddenly quite interested. Iced tea was born. Today, roughly 80% of the tea consumed in the United States is served cold. making it one of the country's most popular beverages, despite Americans' general preference for coffee. The tea bag arrived around the same time, through a happy accident. In 1908, a New York tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan was sending out samples to customers in small silk pouches, intending them to be opened and emptied before brewing. His customers did not read the instructions. They dropped the pouches directly into hot water and found that it worked perfectly well. Sullivan moved to cheaper gauze material, and an industry was born. Tea purists in China and Japan regard the tea bag the way a Neapolitan cook regards canned tomatoes. But for hundreds of millions of people, the tea bag made the whole thing effortless, and effortless drove consumption to levels that loose-leaf brewing never could have reached. Tea culture also fragmented beautifully into regional forms that are almost unrecognizable from one another. In India, chai became the national drink, a spiced, milky brew of cardamom, ginger, cloves, and cinnamon prepared by street vendors called chai wallas, who are as embedded in urban Indian life as the streets themselves. In Morocco, mint tea is a cornerstone of hospitality so serious that refusing a cup in someone's home is considered a genuine insult. It is poured from a great height to build a frothy top and served in 3 rounds, each representing a different idea. In Turkey, tea replaced coffee as the dominant national drink in the early 20th century after the Ottoman Empire lost control of its coffee-producing territories. Turkish tea, called K, is brewed intensely strong in a double-stacked pot and drunk from small tulip-shaped glasses. Turkey now consumes more tea per capita than any country on Earth, over 6.5 pounds per person per year. In the high-altitude Himalayan regions, including Tibet and parts of Nepal, butter tea made from tea churned with yak butter and salt has been a dietary staple for centuries, providing fat and calories in environments where growing food is extremely difficult and the cold is life-threatening. Then there is matcha, which lived for 800 years as a quiet ceremonial tradition inside Japanese monasteries and tea rooms before the rest of the world caught up with it. Starting around 2010, matcha lattes appeared in Western coffee chains. Health stores positioned it as a superfood. Social media filled with bright green drinks and green-streaked pastries. By 2020, the global matcha market had grown to nearly $4 billion and was still expanding. A practice with origins in Tang Dynasty China, refined over centuries by Buddhist monks and samurai, had become a wellness trend on Instagram. Today, tea is grown in more than 50 countries. China leads in production, followed by India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. Global output exceeds 6.5 million tons per year, and somewhere in excess of 2 billion people drink tea daily, nearly a quarter of the human population. Kenya's tea industry alone employs more than 3 million people. There are over 800 tea estates in Assam, covering roughly 770,000 acres. The worldwide industry generates over $200 billion annually. And every single leaf behind all of that, whether it is a delicate, hand-picked Darjeeling, first flush sold for hundreds of dollars per kilogram, or a mass-produced tea bag sold for a few cents, comes from Camellia sinensis, one species, grown in dozens of countries, shaped by how you treat the leaves after picking. Green tea is heated quickly to stop oxidation. Black tea oxidizes fully. Oolong sits between the two. White tea is picked young and barely processed at all. One plant, one set of leaves, and depending on what happens in the hours after harvest, you can produce something as delicate as a white silver needle or as robust as an Assam breakfast tea. Tea started as a few leaves falling into boiling water somewhere in the mountains of Yunnan. It became a medicine, then an art form, then a luxury good, then a tool of empire, then a cause of war, then a ration considered by Winston Churchill to be more important to British soldiers than ammunition. During both World Wars, the British government prioritized tea supply as a matter of national morale, rationing it precisely because nobody could imagine functioning without it. The wars fought over this leaf, the espionage deployed to steal it, the labor exploited to grow it, the revolutions triggered by taxing it. All of that history lives inside something most people treat as completely ordinary. The cup you brew tomorrow morning connects you, without exaggeration, to Tang Dynasty scholars debating water temperature, to Japanese warriors learning stillness in a tiny room, to a Scottish botanist in disguise walking through forbidden mountains, to colonists standing in the dark above a harbor full of floating tea chests. It was never just a drink. It never was. If this story stayed with you, hitting subscribe costs you nothing, and it means we can keep making videos like this one. There are more stories coming, and they are worth being here for.